Welcome back, future teachers. I hope that all of you had a good vacation. Now, let us get started for this second semester with our course, Survey of Philippine Literature in English. But before anything else, let me introduce myself. I am Given Lapid from BSc English 2A, and I will be your discussant for today's lesson. For our first lesson this semester, I am about to discuss the introduction to literature. We are going to tackle its definitions, essence and significance, its approaches, and last but not the least, the overview of Philippine literature. So, let's start. Let's begin this lesson with this question. What is literature? Do you have any idea? Well, it is a body of work, either written, oral, or visual, containing imaginative language that realistically portrays thought, emotions, and experiences of the human condition. As we all know, literature is a group of work of arts made up of word. Most are written, but some are passed on by the word of mouth. Literature usually means works of poetry and prose that are especially well written. They can also be put into groups through their language, historical period, origin, genre, and subject. The word literature comes from the Latin word literatura, meaning writing formed with letters. Of course, literature has its four major classifications, namely prose, poetry, fiction, and non-fiction, which will be tackled in our future discussions. Why literature is important? Literature is important because studying literature is like looking at the mirror of life, where man's experiences, his innermost feelings and thoughts are reflected. Through literature, we learn the culture of people across time and space. We understand not only the past life of a nation, but also its present. Lastly, we become familiar not only with the culture of neighboring countries, but also with that of others living very far from us. All in all, it is important not only in our society, but also in our life. Because literature allows a person to step back in time and learn about life on earth from the ones who walked before us. We can gather a better understanding of culture and have a greater appreciation of them. We learn through the ways history is recorded, in the forms of manuscripts, and through the speech itself. And of course, literature is also a form of time travel that helps put today in context. All those apocalyptic lamentations about how things used to be so much better are controverted in the literature of the last generation, the last century, and all the way back to Shakespeare and beyond. History tells us what people did, but literature tells us what they were thinking. Let's move on with another topic. This time, I will ask you again with another question. Are you familiar with literary standards? Are you familiar? Does it ring a bell? If not, literary standards these are a set of characteristics to determine whether or not a work is literary. Outside of school, we probably read for enjoyment, and our favorites could include everything from comic books to the masterpieces of William Shakespeare. Our preferences are our own, but from academic perspective, some written works are certainly viewed as higher quality than others. These seven literary elements determine whether a specific work is literary, which translates as quality literature. The criteria was developed by the writer William J. Long in his textbook, English Literature, Its History, and Its Significance for the Life of the English-Speaking World. The first literary standard that we have is universality. It says here that great literature is timeless and timely, forever relevant. It appeals to one and all, anytime, anywhere. because it deals with elemental feelings, fundamental truths, and universal conditions. This means that it describes a piece of writing that appeals to the hearts and minds of almost any reader. The appeal is considered universal due to its ability to cross gender, racial, and cultural barriers regardless of the time it's written. Artistry describes literature that is aesthetically appealing and reveals or conveys hidden truth and beauty. This type of literature appeals to broad audiences and possesses a sense of beauty in the writing that could even feel poetic. The third one is permanence. It says here that a great work of literature endures. It can be read again and again as each reading gives fresh delight and new insights and opens a new world of meaning and experience. Its appeal is lasting. Permanence is determined by a written work's ability to stand the test of time, which makes it impossible to determine at the moment of writing. Novels that continue to be read over and over again across decades, either for enjoyment or for fresh insights and ideas, meet this criteria. Many novels enjoy initial popularity but ultimately fade into obscurity with time, failing the permanence test. The fourth one is the style. It says here that this is the peculiar way in which writer sees life, forms his ideas, and expresses them. This means that style refers to the distinct way the author expresses his or her thoughts. Words can be used in unique, creative, and entertaining ways that make the work memorable. Style is another element that is subject to interpretation by readers in terms of its appeal. The fifth one is spiritual value. Literature elevates the spirit by bringing out moral values, which makes a better person. The capacity to inspire is part of the spiritual value of literature. Literature with spiritual value lifts the inner spirit and soul and has the power to motivate and inspire readers. It typically draws on the suggested lessons and moral codes of a society that are depicted in various literary genres. The sixth one is suggestiveness. This is associated with the emotional power of literature. Great literature moves us deeply and stirs our feeling and imagination, giving and evoking visions above and beyond the plane of ordinary life and experience. A suggestive piece of literature relies on emotional power to convey nuances, symbolism, implied meanings, imagery, and messages. The power of suggestion allows the work to inspire and provoke thoughts and understanding beyond the actual words written on the page. Last but not the least, the most important is intellectual value. It takes readers into a bit of a gray area as they may have different opinions about what qualifies as intellectual. But from an academic point of view, intellectual works are relevant to society and thought-provoking. Literature with intellectual value promotes critical thinking that enhances both abstract and reason-based thoughts processes and makes reader focus on the fundamental truths of life and nature. Let's jump to the next topic for this lesson, and that is Philippine literature over the years. To further understand the overview of Philippine literature, let's discuss each period. First on the list is the pre-colonial period from BC to 1564. The characteristics of literature in this era are, it is based on oral traditions, and it is crude on ideology and phraseology. The literary forms under the pre-colonial period are oral literature, folk songs, folk tales, and epics. In oral literature, we have riddles, proverbs, and tanaga. Riddles are the battle of wits among participants. In Tagalog, ito po yung mga bugtong. Proverbs, in Tagalog, salawikain, wise saying that contain a metaphor used to teach as a food for thought. Lastly, tanaga, a monorhyming heptasyllabic quatrain expressing insights and lessons on life. In folk songs, we have hele or ayayi, a lullaby song, ambahan, a 7-syllable per line, often that are about human relationships and social entertainment. Kalusan, work songs that depict the livelihood of the people. Kanogan, song of lamentation for the dead. In folktales, you have myths, legends, fables, and fantastic stories, which are very familiar to us. Of course, in myths, it explains how the world was created, how certain animals possess certain characteristics, why some places have waterfalls, volcanoes, mountains, flora, or fauna. Legends or alamat explains the origin of things. Fables or pabula use an animal characters and allegory. Lastly, fantastic stories. It deals with underworld characters such as Chanak, Aswang, Capre, and others. The second one is the Spanish colonization period from 1565 to 1863. The literature has two characteristics in this period. The first one, it has two distinct classifications, the religious and secular, and it introduced Spanish as the medium of communication. The literary forms under this period are religious literature and secular literature or the non-religious literature. Religious literature. Religious lyrics written by Indiana poets or those versed in both Spanish and Tagalog were included in early catechism and were used to teach Filipinos in the Spanish language. It has two kinds, the Passion and Cenaculo. Passion is a long narrative poem about the passion and death of Christ. The most popular was Ang Mahal na Pasyon ni Jesucristo ang Panginoon Natin by Aguino de Belen. And Cenaculo is the dramatization of the Passion. It shows the passion and death of Christ. Madalas natin itong makita tuwing mahal na araw. In secular literature, you have awit, corrido, and prose narratives. For awit, it is the colorful tales of chivalry made for singing and chanting. Corrido, it is the metrical tale written in octosyllabic quatrains. And prose narratives, it is written to prescribe proper decorum. The third one is the nationalistic or propaganda and revolutionary period from 1864 to 1896. The characteristics of literature in this period are, it planted seeds of nationalism in Filipinos. The language shifted from Spanish to Tagalog. And lastly, it addressed the masses instead of the intelligentsia. The literary forms under this period are the propaganda and the revolutionary. The fourth one is the American colonial period from 1910 to 1945. The American colonial period is divided into two. The first one is the period of apprenticeship from 1910 to 1930. Where Filipino writers imitated English and American models, and poems written were amateurish and mushy, which phrasing and diction is awkward and artificial. The second one is the period of emergence, from 1920 to 1930, were highly influenced by Western literary trends like Romanticism and Realism. The fifth one is the Japanese occupation, from 1942 to 1960. This period is also divided into two. The first one is the warriors, from 1942 to 1944. Tagalog poets broke away from the balagtas tradition and instead wrote in simple language and free verse. Fiction prevailed over poetry. The second one is the period of maturity and originality, from 1945 to 1960. Bountiful harvest in poetry, fiction, drama, and essay. Filipino writers mastered English and familiarized themselves with diverse techniques, and literary giants appeared. The last one is the contemporary or modern period, from 1960 up to present. This period has four characteristics. The first one is martial or repressed and curtailed human rights, including freedom of the press. Writer symbolisms and allegories to drive home their message at the face of censorship. Theater was used as a vehicle for protest, such as the PETA, the Philippine Educational Theater Association, and UP Theater. And from the 80s onward, writers continue to show dynamism and innovation. For our final topic in this lesson, we have the literary approaches. A literary approach is the evaluation of literary works. This includes the classification by genre, analysis of structure, and the judgment of value. For our first approach, we have the formalistic or literary approach. This means that the study of the selection is more or less based on the so-called literary elements. Formalist deals primarily with the text and not with any of the outside considerations such as the author, the real-world audience, or other literature. Meaning, formalists argue that it is inherent in the text, because meaning it is determinate. All other considerations are irrelevant. The second one is the moral or humanistic approach. This means that literature is viewed to discuss man in its nature. It presents man as essentially rational, that is, endowed with intellect and free will, or that the piece does not misinterpret the true nature of man. The third one is the historical approach. Literature is seen both as a reflection and product of the times and circumstances in which it was written. Historical approach relies heavily on the author and his world. In the historical view, it is important to understand the author and his world in order to understand his intent and to make sense of his work. In this view, the work is informed by the author's beliefs, prejudices, time and history, and to fully understand the work, we must understand the author and his age. The next one is the sociological approach. Literature is viewed as the expression of man within given social situation, which is reduced to discussions on economy, which will underscore the conflict between the two classes, the rich and the poor. This approach is concerned with the analysis of the clash of opposing social classes in society, namely the ruling class and the working class, as it shaped the events that transpired in the story. The last one is the psychological approach. Literature is viewed as the expression of personality, of inner drives or neuroses. It includes the psychology of the author, of the characters, and even the psychology of creation. Aside from the characters, the author and even the reader may be criticized as why they exhibit certain behavior during the actual writing and reading experience. And that is it for our today's lesson. I hope you learned something from me. Thank you for listening.